Now you should be able to see the slides. Okay, let me get started. So this is the title of my presentation, Sweatshop Regulation and Global Equality. So when I talk about sweatshops in other circles, actually I have to like spend some rather long time on describing what sweatshops are, what kind of circumstances we find in sweatshops, etc. But in this academic environment, probably I'll need less time to describe sweatshops and the difficulties involved. Nevertheless, I'll still spend some time on the difficulties. Okay, let me get started with my presentation now. Here are the contents of the presentation. First, I'll talk about what sweatshops are. Then I will talk about why one would criticize sweatshops. Then I will move on to sweatshop defenders' arguments on how and why they defend sweatshops. Later, I will give the arguments of critics, sweatshop critics, and their responses to the defenders. And finally, I will talk about my small contribution to the literature, to the discussion, and I will call this this missing element the global equality, the element of global equality. Okay, let me go on. So this picture you see on the screen is a typical sweatshop, or this could be a typical sweatshop. I don't know if this is a picture of a sweatshop or not, but when we think of sweatshop, this is the picture we usually imagine. We imagine a place where usually garments are produced. It's a messy place. There's a lot of work going on. Workers are toiling under quota requirements. They are trying to fulfill quota requirements under difficult conditions. Probably ventilation is not so good. They are not having a lot of work breaks. They cannot have much breaks, etc. So this is the picture that we usually think about when we are imagining sweatshop conditions. They are workplaces where usually many people work under adverse conditions. But ironically, it doesn't have to be always a messy garment factory where we have to call sweatshops. A very tidy place like this one could also be called a sweatshop. Here you see that workers have their own spaces. It's not as crowded as in the previous picture. The place has ventilators, as you can see at the back of the picture. Workers are dressed rather neatly. They don't seem to have as much work to do. But this doesn't show that this place is not a sweatshop. So it all depends on the attributes of the place, attributes of the working conditions or the properties of the working conditions. So we need a working definition. Here is a working definition of sweatshops given by two business ethicists, Arnold and Bowie. This is the definition that many people, defenders and critics alike, refer to when they're talking about sweatshops. Any workplace in which workers are typically subject to two or more of the following conditions would be called a sweatshop. Income for a 48 work-hour week, less than the overall poverty rate for that country, systematic forced overtime, systematic health and safety risks that stem from negligence or the willful disregard of employee welfare, coercion within the workplace, systematic deception that places workers at risk, and underpayment of earnings. So if two or more of these conditions hold, we might safely call that place a sweatshop. So if sweatshops are so horrible places, why do these workers prefer to work in sweatshops? Because the alternatives are even worse. The alternatives are even worse than the conditions that sweatshops offer. One of them is subsistence farming. Subsistence farming requires long hours of hard manual labor, up to 16 hours a day. It's really difficult. And even after that, even 16 hours of hard labor during the day, workers can produce only enough to feed their families and very little to turn into cash and fulfill their other requirements. So it's a really a worse alternative compared to sweatshops. There are even worse alternatives. If you make a short Google search on sweatshops, you will see a lot of articles talking about how these villagers, these people who usually live in, today Bangladesh is the canonical example of a country where sweatshops are operating. It's probably the most existing country in your Google searches. So you would read about news that tell about peasants or villagers living near trash heaps, and they're scavenging for food in these trash heaps. So this is the alternative to sweatshop. There is even child prostitution or other sorts of similar horrendous possibilities compared to sweatshops. So that's why these sweatshop workers prefer to work in sweatshops, although the conditions are really adverse. So this seems to be the definition that I've given until now, or the rather than the definition, the explanation of a sweatshop that I've given until now refers mostly to our feelings, to our emotions. I've shown you pictures. I've tried to ignite certain emotions in you. We need a more robust theoretical reason to criticize sweatshops. And I will explain some of the reasons here. I've written like 5 of them in 5 elements here. Each of these elements have their own literature. There is a wide literature on how these elements should be defined or how they can be used to criticize sweatshops. And all of them, although the pictures ignited such strong emotions in us to criticize sweatshops, these literatures all have certain holes in them. They are not strong enough to fully criticize sweatshops. And I'll go into details of these at times during my presentation. I will not go into details about each element on this slide, but let me just quickly summarize these elements. So first, force of circumstances. Due to the force of circumstances that these villagers find themselves in, they have to work in sweatshops. So force of circumstances usually refer to not having another humane alternative. There are no other humane acceptable alternatives. That's why sweatshop workers work in sweatshops. This seems to be a really good, really sturdy reason, really well-defined reason to criticize sweatshops. But later we will see that during my presentation, it doesn't give enough reason to interfere. Although it gives a reason to criticize sweatshops, it's not enough a reason, it's not a sufficient reason to support interference in sweatshop conditions. So that's the weakness of the first element. When we come to exploitation, exploitation has a huge literature. There's a huge literature on exploitation. And sweatshop critics say, okay, sweatshops offer exploitative working conditions, and that's one very strong reason to criticize sweatshops and to interfere with their workings. But the literature is so vast that we find multiple different, strong, well-defined definitions of exploitation. There is not just one single definition. There are multiple definitions. And let me just give here as a footnote that Marx never gave a definition of exploitation. He gives calculations about exploitation. We understand what he means by exploitation, but he doesn't give a full-fledged definition of it. So when today people are trying to define exploitation, they try to use all the analytical tools of the discipline to give a full-fledged definition of exploitation. And each of these definitions successfully marks certain places as exploitative sweatshops while missing to mark others as exploitative places. So you give a definition, you think like this is a good definition, that definition marks certain places as exploitative sweatshops, but it just has to forego other places as exploitative. It cannot manage to mark all the places that we emotionally call sweatshops as exploitative. And each definition marks different places. There are, of course, intersecting places. Some sweatshops some workplaces are called to give exploitative condition to workers by all of these definitions, or most of these definitions at least. But usually they differ in the places that they pointed as exploitative. So that's the weakness of exploitation, the criticism of exploitation. You can use this criticism to refer to certain places as exploitative and hence required to interfere, but you cannot like mark all the places as exploitative, the places that we call as sweatshops. The third element is inhumane working conditions. So critics sometimes say we have to interfere in sweatshops because they offer inhumane working conditions to their workers. We usually call this the Kantian criticism due to the emphasis Immanuel Kant was putting on human dignity. So inhumane working conditions refer to the idea that these places offer conditions that is in contradiction with human dignity. These places are not suitable for human beings. They are not suitable workplaces for human beings. That's why we are criticizing these places. Also, many of you guys would know Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. They have developed this capabilities approach that's widely used in economic literature as well as in philosophical circles. Their criticism is also based on Kantian philosophical background, and they also use some criticism that we would call inhumane working conditions criticism. This criticism is really strong, but the weak point of this criticism is it provides us an external critic. It doesn't provide an internal critic, but it gives us an external critic. So what do I mean by this? Sweatshop defenders defend sweatshops on welfarist grounds, on I mean, using the economic language, they defend on welfarist grounds, and using the philosophical language, they defend sweatshops on utilitarian grounds. And when you criticize them using the Kantian background, you make an external critique. You criticize their defense, their argument from using a tool that they are not adhering to, that they are not abiding by. So you are using a different tool to criticize their position. This is totally legitimate. This is theoretically totally legitimate, but many scholars think that this is not the best way to criticize an argument. They say, these scholars would say that the best way to criticize an argument is to make an internal, at least an immanent critique like Marx was making for capitalism. So notoriously, Marx is making an immanent critique of capitalism, and he was saying that, okay, you use the concept freedom, but actually freedom has another meaning, you're using it wrong, etc. It's not an internal critique, but it's still close to internal critique. And when you make an external critique, these scholars would say that it's not as strong as an internal critique. The fourth element here, the fourth way of criticizing sweatshops, I think is the strongest one. You are saying that when you're criticizing sweatshops on the fourth element, you are saying that there is the possibility, and hence, and for the reason that there is possibility, there is the requirement to provide better conditions. And this is the utilitarian criticism. This is the, economically speaking, welfarist criticism of sweatshops. And many scholars who are really well known today due to their articles on using the fourth element are basing their criticisms on the utilitarian ground. As I'm saying, many other scholars would still say that Kantian criticism is strong. Nobody is against Kantian criticism, but fourth element provides an internal critique, which many scholars like better. And there can be, of course, other anti-globalization movements, and you can criticize sweatshops from within an anarchist framework, from within a Marxist framework, different versions or variations of Marxist and anarchist framework, or some other even conservative frameworks are used, Christian conservative frameworks are used to criticize sweatshops. So there can be all sorts of other frameworks as well. As you can see, there are many different grounds to criticize sweatshops, but each of these grounds have their own flaws, have their own missing points. I've tried to give an idea of these missing points. We can talk more about them if you guys are, if you guys want to bring some arguments in the question and answer session. But I think the fourth element is the strongest one. So that's why first I will give the arguments of the critics who use the fourth element. Then I will criticize those people and give an alternative to the fourth element, which I think is the strongest way to criticize sweatshops. Okay, let me move on. So from this slide on, for the next 4 slides, I will give a detailed argument, and I will have slides full of writings and sentences. So please, try to keep some focus for the next 10 minutes and try to understand the argument so that we can have a fruitful discussion afterwards. So what do sweatshop critics demand? So these are the arguments of critics. They demand that we should interfere with sweatshops. And when they say interference, here is what they mean. They talk about anti-sweatshop activism by means of unions or consumer boycotts. They are talking about enforcing regulations and laws in the host country where the sweatshops are established. So many of these countries actually have minimum wage laws. For instance, Bangladesh has minimum wage laws, but they are not applied. They are either not applied, they are not enforced, or sometimes the authorities are either bribed or they have other relationships that they just don't check whether these regulations are exercised or not. Regulating the import of these products by tariffs or bans is another way to interfere with sweatshops. So if we are importing products produced in sweatshops, the government, a progressive government, for instance, can say that I'm going to impose tariffs on the products if a company imports products that are produced in sweatshops so that they disincentivize the import of these products. So this is what critics want. They want interference. Also, there is another possibility, manager direct action, and scholars do not consider this an interference. So interference is a technical term. Certain actions are called interference, and some other actions are not called interference, and the major act that's not an interference is manager direct action. Many libertarian economists or business ethicists are in favor of manager direct action. They say interference is bad, manager direct action is good, and of course there is all this discussion about how and why so. Manager direct action means multinational enterprise managers make ethical regulations in these workplaces. Especially many business ethicists focused on the tremendous amount of salaries, annual salaries that CEOs of these companies are getting. They say those manager packages should be cut down to moderate amounts, and the extra amount that's received from those manager benefits and packages should be distributed to the workers, etc. All these alternatives are possible, and it's not called interference, as I said, according to these business ethicists. Through one of these means, critics want that there should be increase in wages, or a minimum wage laws are applied, or workers are paid a living wage, or health and safety conditions are improved in these sweatshops. So here are the prominent articles that are making these demands. How do sweatshop defenders respond to sweatshop critics, or what is their argument rather than response? Their strongest argument can be called the choice argument, and here is what they say: by choosing to work in a sweatshop, workers express their preference to work there rather than doing something else for their livelihood. It is morally impermissible to interfere in this choice because interference would harm or disrespect the workers by taking away their preferred option. It's a very interesting argument, but it's both interesting and seemingly shallow, but I would say it's not as shallow as it seems. Basically, these people are saying, these defenders are saying, workers choose to work in sweatshops, so you cannot interfere in their choice. You cannot take that option out of their hands. That's what they are saying. This seemingly shallow argument actually has some theory behind it. And in order to understand that theory, we have to divide the argument into two parts: harm and disrespect. So these words are not picked randomly. These two concepts refer to two major ethical theories in the literature. Harm refers to the consequentialist or utilitarian framework. They say if you, actually let me read this part that I write under harm. Multinational enterprise managers will decide to lay off workers as a result of increase in minimum wage. Workers who lose their jobs will face serious well-being loss. So when activists are, for instance, boycotting Nike, there was a huge Nike boycott around 20 years ago, and Nike had to improve its conditions in many of its facilities. It had to reveal a lot of information about with whom they are contracting, etc., subcontracting, etc. So it was a successful boycott. But after that successful boycott, Nike also had to lay off many workers. Many workers were laid off because managers wanted to keep profits at a certain level. They didn't want to reduce their profits under a certain level. And these sweatshop defenders are saying that, look, as a result of your boycott, some workers lost their jobs. You have harmed them. This is the consequentialist argument. As a consequence of your action, as a consequence of your interference, these people are harmed. Their well-being have been diminished, reduced. That's the argument. This is the strong theoretical background of this seemingly shallow argument. Another aspect of this seemingly shallow, actually not so shallow argument, is disrespect. So when people refer to disrespect, they are trying to separate a moral wrong that's not harm. Some moral wrongs are harm oriented. Some moral wrongs are not harm oriented, and we want to call them non-consequentialist wrongs. Some wrongs are consequentialist. As a result of a certain action, someone usually loses well-being. Their well-being is reduced. But other moral wrongs are, they have different character, and we want to call them non-consequentialist wrongs. Here, disrespect is a handy non-consequentialist concept. That's why authors usually refer to disrespect. And they say, again, multinational enterprise managers will decide to lay off workers as a result of increasing minimum wage, and workers who lose their jobs are disrespected because their most preferred option is taken away from them. So I will not go into details of how disrespect is different than harm in this slide, but in the question and answer section, we have some arguments about this. I can just say more about it, but the main, take this example as the main difference. Imagine a place where a sweatshop is recruiting a religious minority. And the religious acts of this religious minority is strictly banned outside this sweatshop. But the manager of this sweatshop, apart from being a regular sweatshop in all other respects, like offering horrendous working conditions, low wages, etc., they are just giving a praying area to this religious minority, whose, as I said, religious activities are harshly punished outside this sweatshop. So if you interfere in this sweatshop, you not only harm these workers, but you also disrespect them, because apart from well-being loss, they will also lose something which is not directly related to well-being. That's the chance to exercise, practice, observe their religion as they wish to observe. So this is a different moral wrong. I will not talk about that moral wrong as I said in my presentation, but if anybody is interested, they can talk about it later on in the Q&A session. So this is the strongest argument of defenders. They say sweatshop workers choose to work in sweatshops, and if you interfere, you are harming them, or you are either harming them or you are disrespecting them. That's why interference should not be permissible. It should be banned on moral grounds. And this is it's not only business ethicists. It's not only a couple of business ethicists who are making this argument. Again, if you write sweatshops and sweatshop workers complaints on Google, you will see many interviews with sweatshop workers themselves who are saying that I lost my job as a result of interference, as a result of this large boycott. I'm happy about my friends who kept their jobs because now they are having better conditions. But what about me? I have 2 children, 3 children to feed, and I'm really suffering now. You will see such interviews online. So this argument is not as shallow as it seems. We have to take this seriously. Sweatshop critics try to respond. They do not stay silent in the face of such a strong argument. They have a good response, actually. So this is the welfareist response from sweatshop critics. This is the 4th element in my introductory slide here. This is the 4th element. Possibility and requirement to provide better conditions is a utilitarian reason to criticize sweatshops. I was saying that I find this to be the strongest reason to criticize sweatshops. And here is one response from Michael Cates, this famous business ethicist, who is basing his argument on welfareist grounds. He says, if the analysis of sweatshop defenders is welfare-based, then it has to compare all the gains and losses to decide whether interference is permissible on moral grounds. But Michael Cates is saying that these defenders are focusing only on the people who are harmed. They are not making a welfareist calculation. A welfareist calculation requires to calculate all the welfare gains and welfare losses and make a total calculation, adding them up. And he says a 100% increase in sweatshop workers' income leads to a small amount of layoffs. On the other hand, a 100% increase in income brings a high welfare gain for these workers. Moreover, due to spillover effect, this income increase would increase employment in other sectors. So some people, yes, some people will lose their jobs, but on the other hand, if you look at the overall picture, overall welfareist picture, you will see that actually there is more gain than loss if you add up all the numbers. This is the argument. And even if firm exit is a possibility, firm exit is when a company, when it's threatened by the government, for instance, by increasing minimum wage, a company might say, okay, I'm just moving out of your country, I'm moving to Ghana, I'm moving out of Bangladesh, I'll establish new facilities in Ghana, I don't need skilled workers, my work just needs basic skills, so I can just move my facility really quickly. So they just move their facility to another country, even another continent, and they just can keep their work. I mean, it's not as easy as it sounds, but it's not much difficult either. So this has been done in the past. They can just do this. But welfareist argument says that even if firm exit is a possibility, we have to calculate the overall welfare gain for the global population of sweatshop workers. Maybe all the sweatshop workers of that company in Bangladesh will suffer, they will be harmed, but this time workers in Ghana will gain. So if we want to make a welfareist calculation, we should add up the numbers. So I take to be the strongest argument in the literature as a response to the defenders, but there's a clear hole in this argument as well. There's a clear flaw in this argument as well. And I call this mistake, or I call this flaw, the global equality mistake, or the global equality element that's the missing in this argument. So here is my argument. This is my small contribution to the literature. The welfareist argument that the critics make is based on consequentialist reasoning. While focusing on the overall welfare calculation, critics miss to pay due care to the laid-off workers' objection. Global equality requires that we pay due care to each individual's complaint. And that's why we need a different moral framework, different than consequentialist framework, to capture this moral element. And actually, there is this moral framework that we can use to lead, to give guidance to activists and other people who want to interfere in workings of sweatshops. And that's Tim Scanlon's contractualist ethics. Tim Scanlon, this famous philosopher, famous ethicist, wrote a book in 1998, and he developed a new morality, actually. I mean, when we think of ethics, we usually refer to like old ethical theories of John Stuart Mill or Immanuel Kant or Aristotle. But even in 1998, a very effective, strong ethical theory was developed by Tim Scanlon, and it's called contractualism. So I will base my argument on contractualism, and I will say that, look, critics, you are basing your argument on a consequentialist framework, and it's a really strong argument, but you are missing a very important point, and that point is global equality. And why do I call this equality, by the way? So equality in this literature, or in this meaning, requires us to pay due respect to each person. And paying due respect means paying due attention or due concern or due care, in a sense, to each individual's complaint. We have to listen to people's complaint, each individual's separate complaint, and make a comparison among the complaints. This is the idea here. So in order to explain this idea better, I want to spend like 5 minutes on Tim Scanlon's contractualist ethics, a couple of slides. So this was the final slide with a lot of writings. This was the argument that I wanted you to focus on. From this slide on, from next slide on, I will focus on Tim Scanlon's contractualist ethics, and I will try to apply that ethics to sweatshops, and I will offer my suggestion on how we should interfere in sweatshops. Tim Scanlon, in his 1998 book, gives this example. There is a TV transmission room that from where a World Cup final game is transmitted. I mean, this is the picture that I was using when I gave this presentation for the first time. I think it was during my dissertation defense. This was the TV transmission of BBC in 1930s, I guess, or maybe 40s. I don't know. It's a very old picture. So for this presentation, I wanted to renew this slide, and I just want to switch to this one. This is a contemporary TV transmission room. So imagine a World Cup final game is transmitted from this room. And I don't know how contemporary TV transmissions work, but let's imagine that one channel is broadcasting the game to other channels, and each channel is making their local broadcast. If this information is wrong, we can find another example that will reflect similar idea. Tim Scanlon uses this idea. In this TV transmission room, the World Cup final is transmitted, and around 100 million people are watching this football final game, World Cup final game. This TV transmission person, TV transmission worker, is at some point faces a mistake in the system, tries to fix it, but she starts getting electric shocks. She starts getting electric shocks, and we know that there is only 10 minutes until the game ends, and the only way to take her off the machine is to turn off the main electric source and just cut off the whole system, which will require more than 10 minutes to fix. So like 100 million people worldwide will miss the last 10 minutes of the game, and there will be no other means of getting a nice broadcast of the game. And on the other hand, we have this person who is getting electric shocks, painful electric shocks, and looking to our face and asking for our help. Tim Scanlon says, if we use contractualist reasoning, this is what we face. 100 million football fans on the one hand side, each frustrated like a bit because they are going to miss the last 10 minutes of the game if we turn off the main transistor or whatever the machine is called, the main electrical circuit. On the other hand side, we have one person who is suffering painful electric shocks and who is going to suffer painful electric shocks for 10 more minutes if we refuse to turn off the main electrical source. If we are using consequentialist reasoning, we have to add up, or we can say welfareist reasoning, we have to add up the pain of 100 million people who would suffer just a bit each to the immense suffering of one person. There is a great possibility that the suffering on the right-hand side becomes greater. And the right moral action would then be leave the person, receive the electric shocks, don't turn off the machine, wait for 10 minutes, and then we will save her if she's still alive. That would be the right action. And this seems quite counterintuitive to us. It just strikes our intuitions really as counterintuitive. This cannot be the right action. So there must be, we say there must be a problem with consequentialist reasoning. There must be a serious problem with it. And many scholars, many people who write on these topics, normative ethical issues, say that Whichever, there are multiple versions of consequential aesthetics. It's not just one version. Whichever version you use, you end up with aggregation. We have to aggregate. And welfarist approach in economics also has to aggregate. They have to aggregate benefits and losses. On the other hand, they have to like find out which action to take. Cost-benefit analysis is also benefiting from this aggregative approach. So in cost-benefit analysis, you write costs on the one hand side, you write benefits on the other hand side, you turn each one to the same currency, and then you make your calculation and pick one policy over the other. So you have to aggregate. And Tim Scanlon says there is something significantly wrong with this approach. This cannot be the moral theory that we base our policies on. We need contractualist approach. In contractualist approach, you take pairwise comparison of complaints. And this is why I say paying due care to complaints is the understanding of global equality that I'm referring to here. You take the complaint of each individual separately, and you go on comparing complaints until you have completed all the comparisons. On the one hand side, we have the TV transmission room worker who is suffering painful electric shocks. And on the other hand side, on the other side, we have one football fan who is suffering a bit when the transmission is cut. In this comparison, it's clear that the complaint on the left-hand side is greater. You bring another football fan, you make the comparison again, the left-hand side wins. You bring another one, you do this 100 million times. Each time it's highly probable that the electric shock, the complaint of the person who is receiving the electric shocks will be higher than the complaint on the other side. And contractualist ethics says an action is wrong if it's based on a principle that someone can reasonably reject that principle. The person in the TV transmission room can say that I can reasonably reject the principle, which allows people not to turn off the main electrical source when someone is getting painful electric shocks. That principle can be reasonably rejected. If that's the case, that's the morally wrong action, according to contractualism. And hence, Tim Scanlon says this moral theory strikes our moral intuitions as the right one, so that this is the one that we should be using for basing our policies and our actions on. So coming back to the Sweatshop case, this is the strength of contractualist theory over consequentialist theory. That was Tim Scanlon's theory. Now I'm taking this theory and I'm applying it to the Sweatshop case to fill the missing point that welfarist theorists were making. Don't focus too much on the word ex ante here. It's one version of contractualism. Contractualism has two versions, ex ante and ex post. Ex ante contractualism means we are deciding which action to make, and we are considering the conditions before we take any actions. We are deciding which action is right or wrong before any action is taken or before any policy is enacted. We decide beforehand. That's why ex ante is there. So it's not important for my argument here. In the ex ante approach this time, we pairwise compare the complaints of the risks that individuals take as a result of an act or policy. Coming back to the sweatshop case, there are two options. Option one, interfere in the sweatshops. What's the complaint? The risk of losing one's job. Option two, not interfere in sweatshops. What's the complaint? Certainty of losing the chance to have improved working conditions. If we interfere in sweatshop conditions, there is the risk that some person, some worker will lose their job and they will have a complaint. I'm risking my job. I'm complaining that this interference should not take place. That's what one worker could say. Another option is not interfering, but then another worker or even the same worker could say, look, you're not interfering, but I'm losing the certainty of having improved working conditions. If you were boycotting Nike, then I would probably, most probably, I would have improved working conditions, better safety and health conditions, or improved wages, and I'm losing that option. This is my complaint. So you should interfere. So there are two options. So in the contractualist method, as in the electric shock case, as in the TV transmission case, we compare complaints. Here now we have to compare these complaints. It's a difficult task. It's not easy to compare these complaints. There's a method within the contractualist tradition called argument from the single person case. If the people who are making the complaints share a similar standpoint, these are all terminology that's going on here, but it's not very important. If they share a similar standpoint, in the TV transmission case, they were not sharing a similar standpoint. But in this case, the people who make the complaints are sharing a similar standpoint. So I can think of the case as if one person is making a decision. One more person is comparing options. Each sweatshop worker is in a position to compare the risk of losing their job as the result of interference to losing the chance to have improved working conditions. So, two conditions under which the contractualist approach differs from the consequentialist approach. I haven't given the answer to this question yet. I will give it at the end. And the answer will not be as precise as you would expect, but I think it's still a better answer than the consequentialist answer. So then there can be two cases where this comparison would give a different answer than the consequentialist approach. First case is when we can determine expected victims. If we can determine expected victims, there is the possibility that we should not interfere. What do I mean by the expected victims? Sometimes we can gather, unions or other organizations can gather from within a workplace using spies or all sorts of other sources. They can gather information from a workspace and they can find out that the workplace is planning to lay off, let's say, 1,000 workers. And if the workplace had already recruited, like say, 2,000 new workers or 1,000 new workers, probably they would be the target. So newly recruited people are most probably the target of these layoffs. So we can determine the expected victims. In another case, workers who are working in a place for the longest time would be the expected victims because they are expecting to get some severance payment as a result of layoffs. So maybe they would be laid off before they reach the point of deserving the severance payments. So if we can determine expected victims, then this comparison is not that difficult because then the standpoints differ. Expected victims will say that I'm almost certain to lose my job and I'm a sweatshop worker. If I lose my job, I'm going to scavenge for food in the trash heaps. That's not acceptable, don't interfere. Then it's highly probable that we should not interfere in the workings of sweatshops until we can find a remedy for expected victims. And this is a clear divergence from consequentialist approach, clear divergence. The second condition is when we cannot determine expected victims, we should still try to make everyone an expected winner. And unless we can do that, we are not supposed to interfere. Because here it's a difficult comparison. Each sweatshop worker, if they lose their job, the other option is like going back to subsistence farming or scavenging for food or even more horrible possibilities. So they don't want to lose their jobs, but on the other hand, their conditions are really, really harsh. They cannot keep working under these conditions. So it's a really difficult situation. As long as, according to contractualist literature, as long as we can make expected victims, we can turn them into expected winners ex ante before we take any action, then we can interfere. Because if we can make them expected winners, that means even if they are laid off, even if they lose their jobs, we expect them to become winners. And how do we make them expected winners? And here is the very summary of the theory to make them expected winners. We should reduce harm and increase benefits. That's the way to turn expected victims into expected winners. And to reduce harm, I mean, we should avoid interference if company targeted activism is not possible. So many of these companies, for instance, Nike or H&M or any other company, Gap, any other company, big company that you can imagine, are using contractors and subcontractors in Bangladesh, for instance. If you target the Bangladeshi company as your boycott target, that's a mistake. Then you're not having the right target. People will lose their jobs and you are not making anyone an expected winner. You should not do that. You should target, and it's not always easy to find for which large brand name these small companies are working for. You have to use spies, you have to gather information. It's really difficult. It's not easy to learn for whom they are making these productions for. You have to find that information. Unless you can find that information, probably you should postpone interference. You should not interfere. And you should increase the benefit, which means you should have a fund to compensate some of the losses of those who lose their jobs. So unions already have some funds to support workers during the time of strikes. They should form leagues with other unions, or they should ask for international unions for their help before any sort of boycott, or international unions should cooperate with local unions there are not very strong unions in Bangladesh. So, but there are still groups. So you can just try to find these groups and try to organize with them and make sure they can support workers who stand to lose their jobs for an extended period of time. It's usually 3 months. It's usually 2 to 3 months until a sweatshop worker can find a new job, and you should be able to feed these people and their families in that time. Otherwise, you're not supposed to interfere. So this theory, this contractualist approach, gives a clear divergence with consequentialist approach, welfareist approach. I think this is the approach that's more in line with the idea of equality, and this is what I call the missing element, global equality. Thank you very much. This is all.